The Louisiana sun beat down mercilessly on the cane fields of Bellefontaine Plantation in August 1854, turning the air thick and suffocating. 22-year-old Elijah worked alongside 30 other enslaved souls, his machete rising and falling in the rhythm he'd known since childhood. Sweat poured down his dark skin, stinging the fresh welts on his back from Overseer Brennan's whip, but physical pain had become background noise. What consumed Elijah now was the gnawing absence that had hollowed out his chest. His father, Moses, had been gone for 3 days. "Keep moving, boy," Brennan's voice cracked across the field. The overseer sat atop his horse, a flask of whiskey never far from his lips. "Your daddy ain't here to slack for you no more." Elijah's jaw clenched, but he kept his eyes down and his blade moving. Around him, the other workers maintained their careful silence, the survival instinct of people who'd learned that words could cost you your tongue. That evening, as the sun descended and turned the sky blood orange, Elijah trudged back to the slave quarters. The cabins were crude structures of cypress wood and mud, built in 2 rows facing each other. He shared his cabin with his younger sister, Ruth, 16, who worked in the plantation house as a servant. Ruth was already there, her face streaked with tears. The cabin was small, 1 room with a dirt floor, a stone fireplace, and 2 straw mattresses. "Any word?" Elijah asked, though he already knew the answer. Ruth shook her head. "Master Thornton came down from the big house today. He told everyone Papa ran off, said he stole provisions and disappeared in the night, probably trying to make it north." "That's a goddamn lie." Elijah's voice was low and dangerous. "Elijah, hush! These walls hear everything." Ruth grabbed his arm desperately. "You know Papa wouldn't run, not without us, not without telling us." Elijah knew. Moses had been 53 years old, his body broken by decades of brutal labor. His left leg had been shattered years ago when a loaded cane cart rolled over it, leaving him with a permanent limp. Running north would have been impossible. The door suddenly swung open. An old woman named Aunt Betty stepped inside, her weathered face grave. She'd been at Bellefontaine longer than anyone, had seen 4 different Thorntons own this cursed land. "Children," she said softly, pulling the door closed. "I need to tell you something, but you got to swear you won't do nothing foolish." Elijah's heart began to pound. "What is it? 3 nights ago I couldn't sleep. I heard voices by the levee, so I crept to the window. I saw Master Thornton and Brennan dragging something heavy, wrapped in canvas, had Moses's limp." Aunt Betty's voice cracked. "They took him out toward the old cypress grove, where the ground stays soft, where the gators nest. I'm sorry, child. Your papa didn't run. They killed him and fed him to the swamp." The world seemed to tilt beneath Elijah's feet. He gripped the rough wooden table, his knuckles going pale. Images flashed through his mind. His father's gentle face, the songs he used to sing while working, the way he'd taught Elijah to read in secret using a torn Bible they'd hidden in the floorboards. "Why?" The word came out strangled. "Your papa heard something he shouldn't have. Master Thornton's been selling off land parcels he don't actually own, forging deeds, taking money from buyers up north. Your papa overheard him telling his brother about it. Thornton couldn't risk him talking." "Papa couldn't talk even if he wanted to," Ruth whispered bitterly. "Who would believe a slave? That's the devil of it," Aunt Betty said. "Thornton's paranoid. His cotton crops failed 2 years running, and he's drowning in debt. He's desperate, and desperate men see threats everywhere." Elijah felt something cold and hard settle in his chest, like a stone dropped into deep water. Grief, yes, but something else too, something darker. "The next morning, Master Thornton came looking for you, Elijah. He told everyone Moses had run off, warned that anyone who tried to follow would hang. Then he pulled you aside. You remember?" Elijah remembered. Thornton had stood too close, his breath reeking of tobacco and brandy. His grey eyes, cold as January rain, had bored into Elijah's face. "Your father has abandoned you," Thornton had said with false sympathy. "But I'm a Christian man. I'll keep you and your sister safe here, give you both protection. As long as you work hard and keep your heads down, nothing bad will happen to you. You understand what I'm saying, boy?" It hadn't been an offer. It had been a threat, wrapped in velvet. Now, standing in the dim cabin with his sister sobbing and Aunt Betty watching him with worried eyes, Elijah understood the full scope of Thornton's manipulation. The master had killed Moses and then positioned himself as Elijah's protector, ensuring the son's silence through fear and false gratitude. "What are you thinking, child?" Aunt Betty asked quietly. Elijah looked up, and Ruth gasped at the expression on his face. It was calm, almost peaceful, but his eyes burned with something that made even Aunt Betty step back. "I'm thinking that Master Thornton made a mistake," Elijah said slowly. "He should have killed me too, because I'm going to make sure that bastard pays for what he done. Not quick, not easy. He's going to know exactly why he's suffering before the end." Outside, the night sounds of Louisiana rose in a chorus. Crickets and frogs, the distant howl of a dog, the whisper of wind through the cane. Somewhere in the darkness, the Mississippi River rolled on, indifferent to the tragedies that played out along its banks. In the big house on the hill, Master Jeremiah Thornton sat in his study, drinking imported scotch and reviewing his forged land deeds by lamplight, having no idea that the young slave who'd bowed his head so submissively that morning was now planning something that would shake Bellefontaine to its foundations. The game had begun, though only one player knew it yet, and Elijah had nothing left to lose. If you're hooked by Elijah's story and want to see how his revenge unfolds, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapters of this intense journey. The weeks following Moses' murder passed like a fever dream. Each morning, Elijah rose before dawn, joined the other workers in the fields, and bent his back to the cane with mechanical precision. To anyone watching, he was the picture of a docile slave. Eyes downcast, movements efficient, never speaking unless spoken to. But inside, a transformation was taking place. Elijah perfected the duality required for survival in bondage, the face you showed your masters and the one you kept hidden. He smiled when Brennan rode past. He said yes, sir, and no, sir, in the exact tone of subservience that white men expected. He worked harder than anyone else, often volunteering for the most grueling tasks. Master Thornton noticed. "That boy Elijah is finally showing some sense," Thornton remarked to his wife one evening over dinner. Sarah Thornton was a pale, thin woman who rarely left the house, preferring to dose herself with laudanum and pretend the screams from the punishment post didn't reach her ears. Working like 3 men. Maybe losing that runaway father of his taught him about loyalty. What Thornton didn't see were the hours after dark when Elijah lay awake in his cabin, memorizing every detail of the plantation's routines. He noted when Brennan made his rounds. He counted how many dogs Thornton kept and where they were kennelled. He observed which floorboards in the big house creaked, information Ruth provided during her whispered visits home. Most importantly, he began to understand Thornton himself. Jeremiah Thornton was 42 years old, the third son of a tobacco dynasty that had collapsed before he could inherit anything meaningful. He'd married Sarah for her dowry, bought Bellefontaine with borrowed money, and spent the last decade desperately trying to maintain an illusion of prosperity he couldn't afford. The plantation was failing slowly, suffocated by debt and mismanagement. This desperation made Thornton dangerous, but it also made him predictable. One September evening, Elijah was summoned to the big house. Ruth met him at the servants' entrance, her face pale. "He wants to see you in his study. Be careful." The study door was open. Thornton sat behind his massive desk, a glass of whiskey in hand. "Come in, Elijah." Close the door. Elijah stood with his hands clasped, eyes focused just past Thornton's left shoulder. Never make direct eye contact. "I've been watching you," Thornton began. "You've shown real character these past weeks, real maturity. I know losing your father was hard, but you've handled it with dignity. That's the mark of a good worker." He paused to sip his whiskey. "I believe in rewarding good behavior. Starting next week, I'm moving you to the stables, care for the horses, maintain equipment, easier work, better conditions. What do you say?" This was the bait. Thornton was offering privilege, meant to make Elijah feel grateful and indebted. It was meant to seal his complicity in the lie of Moses' disappearance. "Thank you, Master Thornton," Elijah said, his voice perfectly calibrated. Grateful, but not too eager. "You're very kind, sir. I won't disappoint you." Thornton smiled, pleased with himself. "I know you won't. Your sister tells me you're a smart boy. Can read a little, can't you?" Danger. Reading was illegal for slaves in Louisiana. "Just a little, sir," Elijah said carefully. "Papa taught me some before he left. Nothing fancy. Enough to read the Bible, mostly." "Well, don't let it distract you from your work. A little learning never hurt anyone, I suppose, as long as you remember your place." "Yes, sir. Always, sir." "Good." Thornton turned back to his papers. "You can go. Report to the stables Monday morning." Outside the study, Ruth appeared from the shadows. Elijah shook his head slightly. Not here, not now. Only when they were safely in their cabin did he speak. "He's giving me access to the stables." Ruth's eyes widened. "That's where he keeps his riding horses, his buggies, all the tack and equipment." Elijah's voice was steady. "He thinks he's rewarding me. He's actually giving me the keys to his kingdom." Ruth grabbed his arm. "What are you planning?" Elijah walked to the loose floorboard where they'd hidden their father's Bible. He pulled it out, opened to a page marked with a pressed flower, Moses' favorite passage from Exodus. "Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe," he read aloud. "Papa used to say, justice was God's work. But what do you do when God don't seem to be listening?" "You become your own justice," Ruth whispered. "Whatever I do, I'll make sure you're safe first," Elijah said. "I don't care about safe," Ruth replied, her voice harder than he'd ever heard it. "I care about Papa getting justice. Whatever you need me to do, I'll do it." In the distance, they could hear Brennan shouting, followed by the crack of a whip. Someone cried out, a sound that cut off abruptly, replaced by sobbing. Elijah closed the Bible and returned it to its hiding place. "Then we'll do this together, slowly, carefully. Thornton wants loyalty. I'll give him loyalty, right up until I take everything from him, just like he took everything from us." Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall. The storm was coming, and Elijah would be ready. Monday morning arrived with fog so thick it turned Bellefontaine into a ghost world. Elijah reported to the stables, finding Samuel already mucking out the stalls. Samuel was in his 50s, a lean man with grey threading through his hair and hands, gnarled by arthritis. He'd been the head stable hand for 20 years. "You Moses's boy?" Samuel asked without looking up. "Yes, sir." "Don't call me sir. Save that for the white folks." Samuel finally glanced at him. "Your daddy was a good man. Taught me to read once. We used to talk about everything except the things that could get us killed. Then he went and talked about those things anyway." "You knew?" Elijah's heart quickened. "I knew he heard something he shouldn't have. Saw him looking worried those last few weeks. I warned him to keep his head down, but Moses always had a conscience, and that's a dangerous thing." Samuel met Elijah's eyes. "I also know he didn't run off. Your daddy could barely walk 10 feet without that leg giving him trouble. Master Thornton killed him." Samuel glanced toward the stable entrance nervously. "Don't say that out loud, not ever. These walls got ears." "Then you know why I'm here." Samuel was quiet, weighing something in his mind. Finally he sighed. "Come with me." He led Elijah to the tack room and pointed to a barrel in the corner. "Lift that." Elijah moved the barrel, revealing a loose board. Beneath it was a hollow space containing a cloth bundle. Samuel retrieved it, unwrapping letters, a ledger book, and a folded map. "Your daddy gave these to me for safekeeping about 2 weeks before he disappeared," Samuel explained. "Said if anything happened to him, I should give them to you when the time was right." Elijah's hands trembled as he took the bundle. The letters were in Moses's careful handwriting. The ledger was in different handwriting entirely. "That ledger belongs to Master Thornton," Samuel said. "Moses stole it from the study. It's got all his fraudulent land deals documented, names, dates, money exchanged, enough to hang him if the law ever saw it." Elijah flipped through the pages, eyes widening. Thornton had been selling parcels of Bellefontaine to northern investors, land he'd already mortgaged to banks in New Orleans. He'd forged deeds, created false surveys, and pocketed thousands of dollars. Why didn't Papa use this? Because who's going to believe a slave over a white plantation owner? Moses would have been hanged for theft before anyone looked at the evidence. One letter was addressed to Elijah directly. "My son, if you're reading this, then I am gone, and Samuel has judged you ready to know the truth. Master Thornton is a thief and a liar, and I have documented his crimes. But more than that, he is a murderer many times over. In this packet you will find evidence of other deaths, slaves who knew too much. He made them disappear, just as I suspect he will make me disappear. Do not seek revenge through violence alone. Make him face what he has done. Make him know fear. Make him understand that even a slave can be the instrument of divine retribution. I love you and your sister. Take care of each other. Remember, they can chain your body, but they cannot chain your mind or your soul." Your father, Moses Elijah, read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face. "There's more," Samuel said. "The map shows where Thornton buried the others, 6 people over the last 8 years. The map was crude but clear, marking 6 locations. One was labeled with Moses's name and a date, August 17th, 1854. "The cypress grove," Elijah whispered, "along with the others." "Master Thornton's having a party this Saturday," Samuel said, changing the subject. "Big affair, inviting plantation owners from 3 parishes, businessmen from New Orleans, even a judge. Your sister will be serving." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because parties mean distractions, the kind of chaos where a smart man might find opportunities, where a ledger might find its way into the right hands, or where other things might happen without being noticed." "Why help me?" Samuel's face hardened. "One of those names on the map? That was my brother James. Thornton beat him to death and told everyone he ran off. I've been living with that for 7 years, too scared to do anything. But maybe I don't have to fight. Maybe I just have to help someone younger and stronger do what I couldn't." "Saturday then," Elijah said. "Saturday. But Elijah, be smart about this. Thornton ain't the only monster here. Brennan's worse in some ways. He enjoys the cruelty." "I know," Elijah said quietly. "Believe me, I'm thinking about all of them." He carefully rewrapped the documents and returned them to their hiding place. Through the stable doors, he could see the big house on the hill, white and pristine and rotten to its core. 3 days until the party, 3 days to plan, 3 days until Jeremiah Thornton would begin to learn what it meant to be afraid. Saturday arrived with perfect weather. Clear skies, moderate temperatures, a breeze carrying magnolia scent instead of swamp stink. Every slave was pressed into service to create the illusion of prosperity that Thornton desperately needed to maintain. Elijah watched preparations from the stable, grooming horses, polishing tack. His hands worked automatically while his mind refined the plan. Ruth visited at midday. 20 guests confirmed, including Judge Beauregard from New Orleans and 3 other plantation owners. Thornton's trying to secure loans. Security. Brennan and his deputies will be watching, but they'll be drinking too. Thornton wants them to look respectable. The study? Thornton will show it off during the evening. He always does. He'll probably take them in groups after dinner, smoking cigars. Perfect. By evening, carriages began arriving. Elijah positioned himself to observe. He watched plantation owners arrive with their wives in silk and taffeta, their parasols and fans and jewelry. These were the aristocracy of slavery, people who'd built fortunes on human misery and called it civilization. Judge Beauregard was corpulent, expensive clothes stretched tight across his belly, eyes that assessed everything in monetary value. He was Thornton's target tonight. The judge had connections to banks and investors throughout the South. As guests filtered inside, Elijah caught glimpses through windows. The parlor blazed with lamplight and candles. Ruth moved among guests with trays, her face carefully blank. Dinner was served at 8. Around 9 o'clock, Thornton began leading small groups to his study. The performance piece, designed to impress with leather-bound books, maps of his extensive holdings, expensive furniture projecting success he no longer possessed. Elijah waited until Thornton was occupied with Judge Beauregard, then slipped away from the stables. The party had drawn attention to the front. The back was unguarded. He moved through memorized shadows. The servants' staircase was narrow and dark. Elijah climbed quickly, avoiding the creaky third step. The second floor was quiet. He reached Thornton's private chambers at the east end. The door was locked, but Elijah had a thin piece of metal, part of a broken bridle bit he'd filed down. After 3 tries, the lock clicked open. The office was cramped and stank of cigar smoke. Elijah lit a candle, shielding the flame. He knew what he was looking for. Thornton's private ledger documenting not just fraudulent land sales, but personal debts, threatening letters from creditors, desperate schemes. It took 10 minutes, but he found it in a locked drawer. The key hung on a chain Thornton kept in his coat, but Ruth had made a wax impression, and Samuel had crafted a duplicate. The ledger was devastating. It included entries about paying Brennan to handle problems and notes about disposing of evidence. Elijah's hands shook, reading his father's name in Thornton's casual scrawl. Moses, eliminated August 17th, problem resolved. Like swatting a mosquito, a sound in the hallway froze him. Footsteps, voices. Judge Beauregard. Simply need to see the contracts again. Of course, Thornton replied. The documents are in my private office. Just let me retrieve them. The doorknob turned. Elijah had 3 seconds. The door swung open, Thornton entering with a lamp, still talking to Beauregard in the hallway. Just one moment, Judge. He stopped mid-sentence, seeing Elijah in the shadows. For a frozen instant, neither moved. Thornton's face went through surprise, confusion, then blooming rage. "What are you?" Thornton began, but Elijah moved first. He lunged forward, not attacking, but trying to get past. Thornton grabbed his shirt. They crashed together, the lamp falling and shattering, plunging the room into darkness. "Judge, help!" Thornton shouted. "There's an intruder!" Elijah wrenched free, leaving Thornton holding torn fabric, and sprinted for the door. Beauregard was in the way, confused and alarmed, but Elijah simply crashed into him, sending the judge sprawling. The hallway filled with people, guests emerging, servants running. Elijah ran toward the servants' stairs, aware of shouts behind him and boots pounding on wood. Ruth saw him and without hesitation dropped her tray, sending glass and food cascading across the floor directly in Brennan's path. The overseer cursed, slipping on gravy. "Sorry, sorry!" Ruth cried, playing clumsy perfectly. Elijah didn't wait. He crashed through the back door into the night, running for the swamp. Behind him, Bellefontaine erupted into chaos. Dogs were released. Men shouted for torches and guns. The party had become a manhunt, but at the edge of the cypress grove, Samuel waited with supplies. Food, water, and most importantly, the ledger Elijah had grabbed in those desperate seconds. "Did you get it?" Samuel asked urgently. Elijah held up the ledger, chest heaving. "Got it, but they know it was me. They'll come after Ruth. Ruth's already safe. She fainted from shock, and Aunt Betty convinced Thornton to let her rest. The old woman's keeping guard." Samuel grabbed Elijah's arm. "But you need to go now. They'll search the swamp at first light. I'm not running. I'm positioning myself for the next move." Samuel pressed supplies into his hands. "There's a half-ruined cabin 3 miles north, deep in the swamp. Hide there. Think, plan. You've started something, now finish it." Dogs barked closer. Torchlight flickered through trees. "Go!" Samuel hissed. "And Elijah, make that bastard pay for all of us." Elijah melted into the Louisiana swamp, the ledger pressed against his chest. Behind him, the elegant party had transformed into a savage hunt. But the prey had teeth, and Jeremiah Thornton was about to discover that some chains, once broken, could never be restored. The tension is building. What do you think will happen when everything explodes? Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the explosive conclusion. The Louisiana swamp at night was ancient, indifferent and deadly. Cypress trees rose like Gothic cathedrals draped in Spanish moss. Water moccasins glided through black water. Alligators dozed on muddy banks. Elijah knew this world. He'd grown up fishing these waters, learning from his father which plants were food and which were poison. The swamp that terrified his pursuers was refuge to him. He found Samuel's cabin before midnight, a half-collapsed structure hidden in a grove where even daylight barely penetrated. Inside, he finally caught his breath. By candlelight, Elijah studied the documents. Thornton's private ledger was devastating. Page after page of fraudulent land sales, bribes to officials, loans through forged collateral. But the final pages made his blood run cold. Problematic property, permanent solutions. 8 names, dates, cryptic notes. James, March 1847. Overheard conversation, eliminated. Brennan handled disposal. Esther, June 1849. Caught reading correspondence. Too risky. B managed situation. The list continued, each entry a casual notation of murder. And there, Moses, August 1854. Stole documents, knew too much. B executed resolution. Swamp disposal. His father's death documented like a business expense. The last entry was dated 3 days ago. Ruth, Moses's daughter. Potential risk. Monitor. May require same solution as father if awareness develops. Thornton was planning to kill his sister. The rage was white-hot and clarifying. This wasn't just revenge anymore. Ruth was in immediate danger, and so was anyone Thornton perceived as a threat. Outside, he could hear distant hounds. Thornton's search party was sweeping the swamp slowly, cautiously. White men feared these waters. Elijah had until dawn. He used the time to think, to transform fury into something cold and surgical. He couldn't go back openly, but he couldn't abandon Ruth or leave Thornton unpunished. The ledger was evidence, but evidence a slave could never present in court. Thornton's word would always supersede his. Justice through legal means was impossible, which left only one path: make Thornton suffer in ways that mattered to him. Then ensure his crimes became public at the moment he was too broken to deny them. The plan that formed was intricate, cruel, and absolutely necessary. It would require patience, precision, and help from unexpected sources. Most importantly, it would require making Thornton feel the same terror his victims had felt. As dawn painted the eastern sky grey, Elijah prepared to do something counterintuitive. He was going back to Bellefontaine's edges, to the network of people who'd suffered under Thornton's reign and were waiting for someone to light the fuse. His first stop was Mercy's shack, 2 miles from the main buildings, home to an elderly woman who'd once been Sarah Thornton's personal maid before arthritis made her unable to work. She was hanging washing, moving slowly. She didn't seem surprised to see him. "Figured you'd come eventually," she said. "Got the whole plantation in an uproar. I need your help." "Help? Boy, I'm 73 and can barely lift a bucket. What help could I be?" "You know things. You were in that house 40 years. You know the Thornton secrets." Mercy's eyes sharpened. "Knowing secrets and speaking them are different things. Gets you killed either way. He murdered my father and plans to kill my sister. I have proof. His own records. But I need to understand him, his weaknesses, his fears. I need to know how to truly hurt him." Mercy studied his face, then gestured inside. "Come, quickly." The interior held surprising decoration. Newspapers, old and yellowed, carefully preserved. "I can read too," she said. "Sarah Thornton taught me when I was young. I read everything. You'd be surprised what gets written down." She settled into a chair with a grimace. Jeremiah Thornton is eaten hollow by fear of being exposed as the failure he is. His father was powerful, his brothers successful. He's always been the weak one who had to cheat and steal. You want to hurt him. Don't kill him, destroy his reputation. Make him worthless in the eyes of those he's desperately trying to impress. How? That party last night. You ruined it but didn't go far enough. Thornton was trying to secure loans. He's 3 months from bankruptcy. You got caught in his office, which made him look weak. But what if his frauds became public? Not whispers, but documented proof presented to the very people he's trying to swindle. The ledger could destroy him if presented properly. But not by me. No one will believe a runaway slave. But they might believe Sarah Thornton, his wife, his miserable, laudanum-addicted, secretly desperate wife who knows more than anyone suspects. Mercy leaned forward. I raised that girl. She's weak, but not stupid. She knows what her husband is, knows about his mistresses in New Orleans, knows about the financial troubles. She stays silent because she has nowhere else to go. But what if she had proof? What if she had reason to believe her own life was in danger? Would she act, if properly motivated, if given no other choice, if made to understand that Jeremiah's destruction is her only survival? Mercy smiled grimly. Yes. And a white woman's testimony would be believed where yours never would. The plan was audacious, but had brutal logic. Elijah would need to get the ledger to Sarah in a way that couldn't be traced. He'd need to make her understand Jeremiah was planning to abandon her. Notes in the ledger about potential escape to Mexico if creditors closed in. He'd need to time everything so when truth came out, it would explode with maximum force. There's something else, Mercy said, about how your father really died. I was awake that night too. I saw them drag Moses, but I also heard them. Brennan wanted to shoot him and be done. But Thornton made them tie Moses's arms and legs, then pushed him into deep water, let him drown slowly, said a quick death was too merciful. The room contracted, his father's last moments, struggling in dark water, unable to swim with bound limbs, knowing no rescue would come. I tell you this not to add pain, but because you need to understand what kind of monster you're facing. Jeremiah doesn't just kill, he makes people suffer, he enjoys it. So when you plan revenge, remember that making him suffer is not just justice, it's the only language he understands. Elijah left as the sun climbed toward noon, mind whirling with new information and possibilities. The swamp stretched before him, and beyond it, Bellefontaine continued its daily routines. But something had changed. The balance was shifting. Thornton had created a system built on fear and silence. Not understanding both could be weaponized against him. The hunter was becoming the hunted, and the reckoning was only beginning. 3 days passed. Bellefontaine existed in suspended anxiety, like heavy air before a hurricane. The search for Elijah yielded nothing. Dogs lost his scent, and even Brennan's brutal interrogations produced no information. He had simply vanished. But items began disappearing. First small things, a saddle, cigars, a bottle of laudanum. Then larger, a hunting rifle, cornmeal, silverware. The thefts were deliberately designed to unnerve rather than simply steal. Whoever was taking these could have robbed the plantation blind, but chose items that would be noticed, that would remind Thornton of his vulnerability. It was psychological warfare, and it was working. Thornton became paranoid. He had locks installed everywhere. He made Brennan and deputies patrol at night. He slept with a loaded pistol, though his hands shook too badly from drink to aim properly. Ruth, still working in the house, reported everything to Samuel, who passed it through the network that had always existed. Subtle signs, coded phrases, messages in songs. Now that network became Elijah's eyes and ears. On the 4th night, Elijah made his move. He'd spent days observing, timing routines, identifying weaknesses. He knew Brennan made rounds at 10, midnight, and 2, but by midnight was usually drunk enough to be sloppy. He knew which dogs could be quieted with salted meat. He knew Sarah Thornton took laudanum at 9 and was unconscious by 10. Most importantly, he knew Jeremiah Thornton spent every night from 11 to midnight in his study, drinking alone, reviewing failing finances, trying desperately to find escape from the trap closing around him. Elijah approached the big house from the east, moving through shadows with practiced ease. He darkened his face with mud, wore dark clothes, moved with fluid silence his father had taught him. The study windows faced the garden. Elijah worked the latch with thin wire, hands steady despite pounding heart. The window swung open, silently. He pulled himself through, dropping softly onto the Persian rug. The study was empty. Thornton hadn't yet begun his nightly ritual. Elijah moved quickly. He brought one of Moses's letters documenting other murders. He placed it on Thornton's desk so it would be first thing the man saw. But he didn't stop there. From his pocket, he produced a small cloth doll, crude, made from corn husks and fabric scraps, but deliberately fashioned to resemble Thornton. It was a conjure doll, the kind used in African spiritual practices that had survived slavery and evolved into Louisiana voodoo. Elijah didn't necessarily believe in its supernatural power, but he knew Thornton did. The man was deeply superstitious, Ruth had reported. He placed the doll in Thornton's chair, positioned so the man would sit on it. Around it, he arranged items he'd stolen: one of Thornton's cigars, a button from his coat, a lock of hair Ruth had cut from his brush. In voodoo practice, these personal items connected the doll to its target. Then, Elijah wrote a message in chalk on the dark wood. "Moses sees you." He was preparing to leave when he heard footsteps. Thornton, arriving earlier than expected. Elijah froze, calculating. The window was still open, but would make noise. The door was opening. He barely made it behind the heavy curtain before Thornton entered, carrying bourbon and a glass. The master was talking to himself. "Goddamn runaway! Goddamn thieves! Goddamn creditors!" Thornton's voice was slurred, already drinking. "Should have killed them all when I had the chance." He sat heavily, and Elijah heard a satisfying grunt as Thornton felt the doll beneath him. Then silence. Long, stretching silence vibrating with tension. When Thornton spoke again, his voice had changed, high and thin with fear. "What in the name of who put this here?" Through a gap, Elijah watched Thornton stand abruptly, the doll falling. The master stared at it with genuine horror, then his eyes found the message. His face went pale. No, this is just nigger superstition, voodoo nonsense." But his hands shook as he picked up Moses's letter. His eyes scanned the page, and Elijah watched the man's face transform as he recognized his own crimes documented. Where did... Thornton spun around, expecting Moses's ghost. His breath came in short gasps. He grabbed bourbon and drank directly, liquid spilling down his chin. From his hidden position, Elijah felt savage satisfaction. This was just the beginning. He wanted Thornton to feel hunted, paranoid, constantly aware his sins were catching up. Death would be too quick. First, the man needed to suffer. Thornton stumbled to the door. Brennan, get in here!" His voice cracked with barely controlled panic. The overseer appeared within minutes, coat buttoned wrong, breath reeking of whiskey. "What is it?" "Someone's been in my study." Thornton thrust the letter at him. "Look at this, and this cursed thing." He kicked the doll. Brennan picked up the doll, studying it. "It's just swamp magic, sir. Doesn't mean nothing. It means someone is threatening me in my own house. They know what I've done. They know everything. Then we find him and shut him up permanent," Brennan said, voice dropping to conspiratorial whisper that still carried to Elijah's hiding place. "And maybe we should move up the timeline on the girl. Ruth might be helping her brother. If we eliminate her, it sends a message." "No!" Thornton's shout was surprisingly firm. "Not yet. She's useful, and killing her now would raise questions. We deal with Elijah first, then we'll discuss the sister." Elijah's hands clenched. They were discussing Ruth's murder like a business decision. Any remaining mercy evaporated. After Brennan left, Thornton paced the study like a caged animal, drinking steadily. Elijah remained motionless, barely breathing. At one point, Thornton stopped in front of a portrait of his father and spoke to it. "I've tried, Father, but it's all falling apart. The crops fail, debts mount, workers become rebellious. And now the very people I've controlled are rising against me. Maybe you were right. Maybe I was always too weak for this." The self-pity was nauseating. Elijah thought of his father drowning in the swamp and felt nothing but contempt for this weak, vicious man who couldn't even own his evil. Finally, near midnight, Thornton collapsed in his chair and passed out, empty bourbon bottle rolling from his limp fingers. Elijah waited 10 more minutes to be sure, then slipped from behind the curtain. He stood over Thornton's unconscious form, close enough to end it right now, one hand over mouth and nose, few minutes of pressure, and it would be over. But that would be too quick. Instead, Elijah took one more item from his pocket, a photograph. It had been in Moses's possession, saved somehow from when Elijah and Ruth were children. It showed the four of them, Moses, their mother Naomi, and two young children with wide, hopeful eyes. Elijah propped the photograph against the lamp on Thornton's desk, positioning it so it would be first thing the man saw when he woke. Then he left through the window, closing it carefully, leaving no trace except evidence of Thornton's guilt and Moses's ghost watching from a faded photograph. Outside, threatened rain finally began, soft, steady downpour that would wash away footprints and blur nightmares into morning confusion. Elijah disappeared into darkness, already planning his next move. The poison was in the well. All that remained was to let it spread. Morning after Elijah's intrusion, Bellefontaine woke to discover its master had gone mad, or at least that's how it appeared. Thornton stood on the front veranda in his nightshirt, hair wild, eyes bloodshot and darting. He'd apparently been awake all night, drinking and ranting about ghosts and curses. "Search everything," he screamed at Brennan. "Every cabin, every corner. Someone is helping that runaway. Someone is conspiring against me. Master, perhaps you should rest." Sarah appeared in the doorway, voice tentative. "Rest? Rest?" Thornton whirled on her. "How can I rest when my own property is being used against me? When the dead rise up to—" He caught himself, realizing how unhinged he sounded. "Just get back inside. This doesn't concern you." But it did concern Sarah more than her husband realized. Because that morning, tucked into her jewelry box where only she would find it, was a carefully folded letter written in Jeremiah's hand, a draft he'd foolishly kept of correspondence with a mistress in New Orleans, detailing plans to abandon Sarah and flee to Mexico with his lover and whatever money he could salvage from fraudulent schemes. Ruth had placed it there on Elijah's instructions, stealing it from Thornton's private papers during chaos of the previous night. And Ruth had whispered just enough to Sarah over the past days, hints about Jeremiah's infidelity, suggestions about financial problems, carefully planted seeds, that the letter would land like a bomb. Inside the house, Sarah read the letter 3 times. Each reading made her hands shake more violently, but instead of dosing herself with laudanum as she'd done for years, something different happened. Something crystallized inside her, a cold, sharp fury that cut through the fog. Jeremiah was planning to leave her. After everything, after she'd endured his cruelty, his infidelities, his humiliations, he was going to abandon her penniless in a region where divorced or abandoned women were social pariahs. She called Ruth to her room. "Mrs. Thornton?" Ruth entered cautiously. Sarah studied the girl, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in years. She saw intelligence in those eyes, and carefully hidden rage that mirrored her own. "Your brother, the one they're hunting. Elijah." Ruth's face became carefully blank. "Yes, ma'am." "Is he still alive?" A pause. "I believe so, ma'am." "And is he responsible for what's been happening? The thefts, the messages, the disturbances?" Another pause. Ruth seemed to be calculating, deciding how much truth to risk. Finally, "My brother loved our father very much, ma'am, and he knows what happened to him." Sarah's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "I mean our father didn't run away, Mrs. Thornton. I mean he was murdered, and I mean we know who did it and why." The words hung in the air, confession and accusation all at once. Sarah could have called for Brennan, could have had Ruth whipped or worse. Instead, she asked the question poisoning her thoughts since she found the letter. "Could your brother prove it? Could he prove what my husband has done?" Ruth met her eyes directly, shocking breach of protocol that spoke to the magnitude. "He has documents, ma'am. Master Thornton's private ledgers, records of fraud, theft, and other crimes. If those documents were to reach the right people in the right way, he would be destroyed," Sarah finished. She walked to the window, looking out over the plantation. "And what would become of me if my husband were exposed and imprisoned or hanged?" That would depend on how the exposure happened, Ruth said carefully. If you were seen as a victim, if you were the one who brought his crimes to light, I would be a hero, a wronged woman exposing her husband's villainy. Sarah turned back. And I would likely inherit Bellefontaine, or whatever could be salvaged from it. Yes, ma'am. The two women, one white, one black, one mistress, one slave, stood in that bedroom and recognized in each other something fundamental. They were both prisoners of the same system, just in different ways, and they both had reason to want Jeremiah Thornton destroyed. What would your brother need from me? Ruth told her. Meanwhile, in the swamp, Elijah was meeting with Thomas Beaufort, a free black man who owned a trading post near Donaldsonville. He'd been friends with Moses years ago. Samuel had sent him a message through the underground network throughout Louisiana, a network of free blacks, sympathetic whites, and enslaved people who helped each other survive. Your daddy talked about you often, Beaufort said, settling on the cabin's rickety porch. He was well-dressed in his 50s, with careful dignity of someone who'd bought his freedom and lived in constant tension between two worlds. Said you were clever, determined, said you'd do something important one day. Talking is what got him killed. No, being black in Louisiana is what got him killed. The talking was just the excuse. Beaufort pulled a pipe from his pocket, took his time lighting it. Samuel tells me you're planning something ambitious. Something that could get you hanged if it goes wrong. I'm already a dead man. Either I hang for what I'm doing, or I live as a slave until I die. Neither option appeals. What if there was a third option? What if you could destroy Thornton and escape, make it north, start a new life? I'm not running until he pays. I'm not suggesting you run. I'm suggesting you finish what you started, then accept help getting to freedom. Beaufort leaned forward. The Underground Railroad has routes through Louisiana. Dangerous, yes, but possible. I've helped others escape. I could help you and your sister once this is done. Elijah felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in weeks. Hope. Not just for revenge, but for an actual future beyond it. Why would you risk yourself for us? Because your daddy helped me once, years ago. When I was saving money to buy my freedom, Thornton tried to stop the sale, wanted to keep me enslaved because I was a good worker. Your daddy testified that I was competent to manage my own affairs, which was required under Louisiana law. His word helped convince the judge. I never forgot that. Beaufort's voice softened. And because every blow struck against the system of slavery is a blow for all of us, free or enslaved, we're all in this together. They talked for hours, refining the plan. Beaufort would act as intermediary, someone who could move freely where Elijah couldn't. He would help get documents to the right people, spread information through his network, create pressure from outside the plantation. Most importantly, he would arrange for a boat to be waiting on the river the night of the final confrontation. Escape route for Elijah and Ruth once Thornton's world came crashing down. There's something else, Beaufort said as he prepared to leave. Thornton's not the only monster you're dealing with. Brennan's worse in his own way. He enjoys the cruelty. I've heard stories about him from other plantations. He leaves bodies behind wherever he goes. Don't underestimate him. I won't, Elijah promised. He's part of the plan too. After Beaufort left, Elijah sat alone in gathering dusk, thinking about the web he was weaving. Sarah Thornton, motivated by betrayal and self-preservation. Ruth, feeding information from inside the house. Samuel, providing supplies and intelligence. Beaufort, offering outside resources and escape route. And Elijah himself, the invisible hand pulling strings and tightening nooses. Thornton had spent years building a kingdom of cruelty, convinced fear and violence would keep everyone in line. But fear eventually transformed into rage, and rage into action. He'd created his own destruction and never realized it. That night, back at the plantation, Thornton sat in his study, surrounded by locked doors and loaded guns, jumping at every sound. He'd spent the day tearing apart the slave quarters looking for Elijah, finding nothing but resentful faces and careful silence. The photograph of Moses's family still sat on his desk. He'd tried to throw it away 3 times, but kept finding it back in place. Though he lived alone in the study and kept the door locked, he was beginning to believe in ghosts. Outside his window, invisible in darkness, Elijah watched. He'd climbed the old oak tree near the house, positioning himself where he could see into the study without being seen. He watched Thornton drink himself into stupor, watched him talk to empty air, watched him slowly lose his grip on the reality he'd once controlled. Absolutely. The psychological torment was working even better than hoped. Thornton wasn't sleeping, wasn't eating properly, was making increasingly erratic decisions. The plantation was starting to notice. Whispers were spreading among the white community. Had Thornton lost his mind? Was the pressure of his debts driving him to madness? Tomorrow would bring the next phase, the one that would begin Thornton's public unraveling, not just his private terror. Elijah climbed down from the tree and disappeared into the night, a ghost indeed, but one with very material plans for revenge. The end was approaching, and it would be glorious and terrible in equal measure. Indeed, this powerful story of justice and resistance is reaching its conclusion. If this story moved you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel and share it. The final chapters await. Judge Beauregard returned to Bellefontaine on a Tuesday morning in late September, unexpected and uninvited. His arrival sent panic through the house. Thornton had been avoiding all social contact since the party disaster, and a visit from someone of Beauregard's stature meant scrutiny he couldn't afford. But the judge wasn't alone. With him were 2 other men, Charles Dupree, a prominent banker from New Orleans, and Michael Calhoun, a lawyer known throughout Louisiana for his meticulous approach to business disputes. This wasn't a social call. This was an investigation. Sarah Thornton had sent them a letter. The letter, delivered through Thomas Beaufort's network to ensure it couldn't be traced directly to her, contained explosive allegations. She claimed her husband had defrauded multiple parties through false land sales, that he maintained 2 sets of books documenting his crimes, and that he'd murdered witnesses who threatened to expose him. She included just enough specific details, drawn from the documents Elijah had obtained, to make the claims credible. Most brilliantly, she positioned herself as a terrified wife who'd only recently discovered her husband's villainy and felt compelled by Christian conscience to expose him despite the personal cost. Thornton met them in the parlor, trying to project calm authority, but sweating through his shirt despite the cool morning. "Gentlemen, this is unexpected. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Judge Beauregard's face was grave. "Jeremiah, we've received some very serious allegations. I'm here in my capacity as a judicial officer to make preliminary inquiries. Mr. Dupree represents the Bank of Orleans, which holds mortgages on your property. Mr. Calhoun is here as a neutral legal observer. Allegations? What allegations?" Thornton's voice pitched higher than he intended. Calhoun opened a leather satchel and produced several documents. "We've been informed that you've sold parcels of Bellefontaine to multiple parties. Parcels that were already pledged as collateral to the bank. We've been informed that you've forged survey documents and deeds, and we've been informed that you've eliminated individuals who discovered these frauds." "That's insane! Who would make such claims? This is slander." "Your wife made these claims, Jeremiah," Beauregard said quietly. The color drained from Thornton's face. "Sarah? Sarah said these things? She sent a letter detailing your criminal activities. She also claimed to have discovered documentation in your possession that proves these allegations." Beauregard's eyes were cold. "I've known you since you were a boy, Jeremiah. I don't want to believe this, but the specificity of the claims, the credibility of the source, we have no choice but to investigate." For the next 4 hours, the 3 men systematically dismantled Thornton's financial facade. They examined ledgers, compared documents, identified discrepancies. Calhoun proved devastatingly thorough. He'd brought survey maps from the parish office and cross-referenced them against the properties Thornton claimed to have sold. The frauds were obvious once someone actually looked. 23 parcels, Calhoun announced as evening approached. 23 separate instances of fraudulent sales. You've collected approximately $40,000 from buyers in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia for land you don't actually own. The mortgage obligations to Mr. Dupree's bank total another $60,000. You are insolvent, sir, and have been for at least 2 years. Thornton sat slumped in his chair, the fight gone out of him. It was supposed to work. The cotton crop was supposed to recover. Sugar prices were supposed to rise. I was going to make it right. You were going to run, Beauregard said. We found your travel documents, train tickets to Mexico, arranged under a false name. You were planning to flee, leaving your creditors unpaid and your wife abandoned. That's not, I wouldn't. But the lie died on Thornton's lips. There was no point denying what they'd already proven. There's still the matter of the more serious allegations, Calhoun said. Your wife claims that multiple enslaved people have disappeared under suspicious circumstances, and that you ordered their deaths to silence them. You can't prove that, Thornton said, finding a bit of his old defiance. She's making wild accusations based on nothing. Slaves run away all the time. Then you won't mind if we examine your property, Beauregard said. Mrs. Thornton indicated several locations where bodies might be found. If her claims are false, you'll be exonerated. If they're true, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Over the next 3 days, investigators dug in the locations marked on Moses's map. They found 6 bodies, all showing signs of violent death, all identified as enslaved people who disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The trial lasted 3 days in November 1854. Sarah testified against her husband, dressed in widow's black, her testimony devastating in its calm specificity. She claimed she'd discovered his crimes only recently, that she'd been horrified and terrified, that she'd felt compelled by Christian duty to expose him despite the personal cost. Most of Louisiana society believed her. A few suspected she'd known more than she admitted, but even they had to admire her performance. Thornton's defense was incoherent. He blamed Brennan for everything, claimed he'd been manipulated, insisted the ledgers were forgeries, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, guilty on all counts. Thornton was hanged on December 18, 1854, in the parish square. It was a cold, grey morning. Hundreds attended. As the noose was placed around his neck, Thornton's last words were about Elijah. The slave did this, he said, his voice hoarse but carrying. Moses' boy. He's out there somewhere laughing at all of you. You think you're upholding justice, but you're just puppets for a runaway nigger who manipulated all of us. Then the trapdoor opened, and Jeremiah Thornton fell into darkness. The crowd didn't know how right he was. Brennan continued his brutal patrols, even after Thornton's arrest, maintaining order through the only means he knew, fear and violence. But one night, 10 days after the trial, hands seized him from behind as he walked his route. The blow came from behind, not fatal, just enough to stun. Brennan dropped to his knees, hand going to his pistol, but hands seized his arms, and the gun was torn away. What the... Who the hell? His words cut off as a gag was forced into his mouth. He was lifted by multiple sets of hands and carried swiftly into darkness. They carried him deep into the woods, to a clearing where a fire burned low. As Brennan's vision cleared, he saw faces in firelight, slaves from Bellefontaine, at least a dozen. And at the center, standing with terrible calm, was Elijah. "Hello, Mr. Brennan," Elijah said softly. "We need to have a conversation." Brennan's eyes bulged with rage and fear. The slaves forced him down onto his knees, tying his hands behind his back with rope that cut into his wrists. "You don't remember me specifically, do you? I'm just one of many you've whipped, starved, and terrorized over the years. But I remember you. Every scar on my back is a memory of your cruelty, and I remember what you did to my father." At the mention of Moses, Brennan's eyes widened with understanding. He'd killed so many that individual victims blurred together. But he remembered Moses, the proud, literate slave who'd looked at him with such contempt even as he drowned. "My father tried to do this the right way," Elijah said, standing and beginning to pace. He documented Thornton's crimes, gathered evidence, tried to figure out how to bring justice through proper channels. And what did that get him? Tied up and drowned in the swamp like a dog. You did that, Mr. Brennan. You personally. I know because someone saw you. Around the clearing, the other slaves stood silent, faces illuminated by firelight. They were witnesses and jury, and their verdict had already been rendered. Now, Master Thornton is arrested, and they're digging up the bodies you buried. That's evidence of murder. You're going to hang, or maybe you'll get lucky and just spend the rest of your life in prison, though I doubt that. What I'm offering you tonight is something different. He nodded to Samuel, who stepped forward with paper and pencil. You're going to write a confession, Elijah said. Every murder you committed on Thornton's orders, every crime you witnessed, every piece of corruption and fraud and cruelty. You're going to document it all, and you're going to sign it. Brennan shook his head violently, making angry sounds behind the gag. I should clarify, this isn't a request. You're going to write that confession one way or another. The only question is how much you suffer before you do. These men and women around us, they've all felt your whip. They've all lost family to your cruelty. They're very motivated to see you cooperate, and we have all night. The gag was removed. Brennan immediately spat and cursed. You fucking animals! You think you can threaten me? You think anyone will believe a word you darkies say? I'll see every one of you hanged. The knife appeared in Elijah's hand so quickly, Brennan didn't see the movement, only the blade suddenly pressed against his throat. You'll see nothing, Elijah said, voice dropping to a whisper, because you're not leaving this clearing alive. The only question is whether you die quickly or slowly. The only question is whether you go to your grave as a defiant murderer or as a broken coward who confessed everything. Choose, Mr. Brennan. Choose now. For the first time in his career of cruelty, John Brennan felt genuine fear. He'd spent decades as the enforcer, the one who held power of life and death over others. Now, bound and helpless, surrounded by the very people he'd terrorized, he understood what it felt like to be powerless. You won't do it, he said, but his voice shook. You kill a white man, every slave in Louisiana will suffer. They're going to use someone as an example anyway. Elijah interrupted. Might as well be the man who actually deserves it. Besides, who says they'll find your body? The swamp is very good at making things disappear. You taught us that yourself. The truth in those words broke something in Brennan. He looked around at the faces and saw no mercy, no hesitation, only cold determination. These weren't the cowed, beaten people he'd controlled through fear. These were people who'd moved beyond fear, into something far more dangerous. What do you want me to write? He asked, voice barely audible. Everything, Elijah said. Start with Moses and work backward. Names, dates, methods, who gave the orders, who carried them out, where the bodies are buried. Everything. For the next hour, with his hands untied but a knife always at his back, Brennan wrote. His handwriting was crude, but he documented years of murder with mechanical precision. 6 bodies in the cypress grove, 3 more in the swamp, 2 burned in fires that were made to look accidental. Names, dates, methods. By the time he finished, the pages were filled with enough evidence to hang a dozen men. Elijah took the confession and read it carefully, checking it against Moses's map and the information he'd gathered. It was complete, damning, irrefutable. Now what? Brennan asked. Some part of him still hoped for mercy, for some way out. Now, Elijah said quietly, you pay for what you've done. The execution was not quick. The assembled slaves had waited years for this moment, and they wanted Brennan to feel at least a fraction of the pain he'd inflicted. But Elijah, while allowing them their justice, also ensured it ended. He'd learned violence from Brennan himself, had studied cruelty at the hands of a master, but he refused to become the thing he hated. When it was over, they wrapped Brennan's body in weighted canvas and carried it deep into the swamp, to a place where the water was black and bottomless, and gators lurked in the shadows. They said no words over him, offered no prayers. He simply disappeared into the Louisiana darkness, becoming another ghost in a land already haunted by too many. Back in the clearing, Elijah looked at the confession in his hands. This document, combined with Thornton's ledgers and Sarah's testimony, would ensure that the truth came out. Not just the story of Moses' murder, but the broader narrative of systematic violence and exploitation that characterized plantation life. "What will you do now?" Samuel asked. "Beaufort's boat is waiting. You could leave tonight, start a new life north." Elijah looked at the faces around him, people he'd known his entire life, people who'd suffered alongside him, people who'd taken enormous risks to help him achieve this revenge. "I can't leave yet," he said. "There's one more thing I need to do, one more person who needs to face what they've done." But in truth, the work was done. Brennan's confession would be delivered to the authorities. The truth would spread, and Elijah could finally leave this cursed place behind. "Tomorrow," Elijah told Samuel, "Brennan's confession becomes public. All of Louisiana will see what slavery really is." The group dispersed into the night, each person returning to their cabin, carrying the secret of what they'd done. They would never speak of it, not even to each other. Some secrets were too dangerous to share. Elijah made his way to the river, where Beaufort's boat was indeed waiting. This time, he boarded. Ruth was already there, along with Sarah Thornton, who decided that fleeing Louisiana was her only path to survival. As the boat pushed away from the dock, Elijah looked back at Bellefontaine one last time. The plantation was dark and quiet, unaware that its overseer had vanished in the night, just as so many slaves had vanished before him. But this time, the symmetry felt right. This time, the cruelty had come full circle. And somewhere in the swamp, the spirits of the dead could finally rest. By the time Thornton hanged, Elijah was in Pennsylvania. The 7-week journey north through the Underground Railroad had been dangerous. Every day brought the risk of capture, of slave catchers, of betrayal. But somehow, impossibly, he'd made it. Ruth had come with him, along with Sarah Thornton. The unlikely trio had traveled together as far as Ohio, where Sarah had family who agreed to take her in. She'd signed over what little remained of Bellefontaine's assets to Ruth and Elijah before they parted, a gesture that couldn't undo decades of complicity, but at least acknowledged debt. "I can't ask you to forgive me," Sarah had said during their final meeting. "I don't deserve forgiveness, but I hope you can believe that I'm grateful you gave me a chance to do one right thing after a lifetime of wrong ones." "I believe you," Ruth had replied, "and I hope your new life is better than your old one." Now, on a January morning in 1855, Elijah stood in a small room in Philadelphia, holding a newspaper that carried the story of Thornton's execution. The article was surprisingly sympathetic to the murdered slaves, describing their suffering in detail and questioning the moral foundation of a system that made such cruelty possible. Brennan's confession had been published in full, and its stark documentation of violence had shocked even hardened readers. "You did it," Ruth said from the doorway. She'd found work as a seamstress, was learning to live in a world where she could walk down streets without permission, could keep money she earned, could make decisions about her own future. Papa would be proud. Would he? "I killed men, Ruth. However justified, however necessary. I became a killer." "You became a survivor," Ruth corrected, "and you made sure the truth came out. That matters more than you know. Look," she handed him another newspaper, this one from New York. "They're using Brennan's confession in abolition literature. Frederick Douglass himself wrote about it. What you did, what Papa started and you finished, it's having ripples far beyond Bellefontaine." It was true. The scandal had become a rallying cry for abolitionists, proof of slavery's inherent violence and corruption. Of course, defenders of slavery dismissed it as an isolated incident, claimed Thornton was an aberration rather than a symptom. But seeds had been planted, questions had been raised, the comfortable lies that allowed people to ignore slavery's horrors had been made slightly harder to maintain. Would it be enough? Elijah didn't know. The Civil War was still years away, the Emancipation Proclamation even further. Change was slow, and meanwhile, thousands remained enslaved. His personal victory, however satisfying, couldn't liberate them all, but it was something. It was more than nothing. That spring, Elijah found work at a Philadelphia printing house, learning the trade that would eventually allow him to publish his own account of what happened at Bellefontaine. He wrote carefully, changing some names, obscuring some details, but telling the essential truth. The manuscript would be published in 1857 as A Slave's Justice, the True Account of Murder and Retribution on a Louisiana Plantation. It sold moderately well in the North, was banned throughout the South, and added one more voice to the growing chorus demanding slavery's end. On the 8th anniversary of Moses's death, August 17, 1862, with the Civil War raging, Elijah traveled to Ascension Parish. The region was under Union control by then, and formerly enslaved people were flooding into federal lines. Bellefontaine Plantation had been abandoned, its fields overgrown, its buildings falling into decay. Elijah made his way to the cypress grove where his father had been buried. The grave markers that Thornton's trial had erected for the 6 documented victims had weathered badly, but they were still there. Moses Williams, Esther Johnson, James Samuel, Thomas Reed, and others whose names deserved to be remembered. "I did what you asked," Elijah said to the quiet earth. "I made him face what he'd done. I made sure people knew the truth. Was it enough, Papa? Did it matter?" The wind whispered through the cypress trees, carrying the scent of swamp water and wild magnolia. No answer came, but Elijah felt a peace he hadn't known in years. His father's murder had been acknowledged. His own suffering had been transformed into action. The system that killed Moses still existed, but it was cracking, slowly but inexorably. That would have to be enough. Elijah lived to see slavery's end. He was 33 when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, 36 when the war ended and the 13th Amendment passed. He attended celebrations in Philadelphia, where formerly enslaved people danced and wept and celebrated freedom that had seemed impossible just years before. He thought often about those who hadn't lived to see this day, his father, his mother, the countless thousands whose names would never be recorded, whose graves would never be marked, whose suffering would be forgotten by all but those who'd witnessed it. But he also thought about resilience, about the networks of resistance that had existed even in slavery's darkest days, about people like Samuel and Mercy and Thomas Beaufort who'd risked everything to help others, about his sister Ruth, who'd rebuilt her life from nothing and now taught at a school for freed children, about Sarah Thornton, who'd chosen truth over comfort, even if that choice had come too late to erase her complicity. The world was changing, slowly and imperfectly. The wounds of slavery would take generations to heal, if they ever truly did. But Elijah had learned something important during his time at Bellefontaine. Individual actions mattered. One person documenting truth, one person refusing to accept injustice, one person fighting back, even when the odds were impossible. It all mattered. In 1889, at the age of 57, Elijah Williams died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by Ruth and her children and grandchildren. His obituary in the Philadelphia Tribune mentioned his work as a printer, his writings about slavery, and his role in the abolition movement. It did not mention Jeremiah Thornton or John Brennan or what had happened in the Louisiana swamp one autumn night in 1854. Some secrets went to the grave, but the truth, the essential truth about slavery's violence, about resistance, about the humanity of the enslaved and the monstrosity of those who enslaved them, that truth survived. It lived in the documents Elijah had preserved, in the testimony Sarah had given, in the confession Brennan had written, in the stories that were passed down through generations. And somewhere in Louisiana, in the swamps and fields where so much blood had been spilled and so many dreams had died, the spirits of the murdered finally rested. Justice had been imperfect, incomplete, deeply flawed, but it had been justice nonetheless. Moses Williams had not died for nothing. His son had made sure of that. In 1924, A historian researching Louisiana plantation records discovered Elijah's published account and became obsessed with verifying its claims. After months of research in court documents, newspaper archives, and parish records, she confirmed that every major detail was accurate. Thornton had been hanged for fraud and murder. 6 bodies had been exhumed. An overseer named Brennan had disappeared. A slave named Elijah had never been recaptured. The historian wrote a paper that was published in the Journal of Southern History, bringing new attention to this forgotten chapter of plantation violence and resistance. It inspired other researchers to dig deeper into similar stories, the hidden histories of enslaved people who fought back, who sought justice, who refused to accept their oppression passively, because that was the final truth that Elijah's story revealed. Slavery was never the peaceful institution its defenders claimed. It was always contested, always resisted, always fought against by people who knew its evil and refused to submit completely. Their resistance mattered, their stories matter, and in telling them, we honor not just their suffering, but their courage, their humanity, and their refusal to let injustice have the final word. The slave who avenged his father did more than kill his oppressors. He ensured that their crimes would be remembered, that their victims would be mourned, and that the truth would survive even when power tried to bury it. That is its own form of immortality. That is justice's longest echo.